So I've spent quite a bit of time in the last few lessons talking about classes because they're so integral to .NET. In fact, just about everything you do in .NET somehow involves a class. And we talked about in the previous lesson how the .NET Framework class library is really just a collection of classes that contains functionality that you can utilize in your projects, but you didn't have to write it yourself because Microsoft has already invested tens of thousands of man-hours writing this rich library of code that you can check out, you can borrow, you can use it in your applications merely by calling methods on those FCL Framework Class Library classes. But because I really want you to understand how the .NET Framework Class Library was put together and how it works, and most of all, how you can get the most out of it, I want us to better understand how the code is organized and how to access code that's not part of your project by default. So in this lesson, we're going to talk about namespaces and the using directive, and then in the next couple of lessons, we're going to talk about adding references to assemblies that are not already part of your project, and even creating custom assemblies or class libraries of your own, and then referencing them from your projects. So let's start with the notion of namespaces. We've seen the word namespace in our code from the very get-go of this series. Within the .NET Framework class library, all the classes are organized into namespaces. So you can think of a namespace like a last name for your classes. So to give this common illustration that I always do, my name is Bob, and there's probably hundreds if not thousands of Bobs in the town that I live in, much less in the entire world. So if somebody comes along and says Bob likes coffee, you might be like, what Bob are you talking about? There's like a billion Bobs in the world. And you're like, no, Robert Theron Tabor likes coffee. You might say, I know who that guy is. And what that does, the middle name and the last name is so unique that it probably only identifies one person in the entire world. I think, anyway. The same is true with classes in the .NET Framework class library. With tens of thousands of classes in the library, it's possible that a class name is used more than once in different areas and different APIs of the entire base class library. And so, by using a namespace, or in other words, by adding an entire name, the full name, the class's last name and middle name, as well as its first name, and referencing it like that, it removes the ambiguity, all right? So while you might know which class name or which version of the class that you were trying to use in your application, the C# compiler needs some explicit instructions in this regard. It tries to resolve the references that you make, the class names that you use in your application, and if it doesn't recognize one of them, it's going to stop you in your tracks and it's going to say, hey, I need you to elaborate. What class are you talking about here? I'm not familiar with this class name. And we saw this in one of the previous lessons, right? Whenever we were trying to use the string builder. So we did something like this: string builder SB equals new string builder. And we saw immediately we get red squiggly lines, and if we were to attempt to actually compile the application by choosing debug build, we're going to get stopped by the C# compiler, and it says, I don't know what you meant by the word string builder. Did you forget something? Did you forget to use a using directive? Did you forget an assembly reference possibly? Okay, so again, the C# compiler needs to know explicitly where it can find this class amongst the entire library of code in the .NET Framework class library, or possibly within your own class libraries that you add to your project. Okay, so we're going to come back to this example in a little bit. I'm just going to delete it for now. Let's just go from the beginning here and use the full name of the string builder class. So we'll reference it like this: system.text.stringbuilder. You can see I've done this a couple of times, and IntelliSense already knows where I'm going with this. Equals new system.text.stringbuilder, like so. Okay. And it looks like Visual Studio is happy, and if we were to attempt to go to debug and build, this time the C# compiler is happy too. And why is it happy? Because now it knows exactly which class we mean. It finds it in the namespace system.text, and it can find the class string builder in that namespace. So let's break this down. At the very top here, we see the name system, and that's like one of the top most namespaces in the .NET Framework class library. It hosts dozens of other child namespaces like the text namespace. And the text namespace does what you think it might do. If we were to take a look at all of the classes that are available inside of this namespace, it talks a lot about encoding and decoding, encoding this way, decoding that way. And simply put, encoding is the process of transforming a set of Unicode characters into a sequence of bytes. In contrast, decoding is the process of transforming a sequence of encoded bytes back into a set of Unicode characters. Now, you would use encoding and decoding whenever you're writing applications for international uses, where the country or the language that your strings are going to be presented in use different character sets. So, for example, the kanji character set versus the Arabic character set versus the English character set, okay? And it's not really the purpose of this lesson, but I highly recommend you take a look at this article on Unicode by Joel Spolsky about Unicode and how we got ourselves into this mess. It's a fascinating read, and as a developer, you probably need to understand this, and I couldn't do any better job than he did back in 2003 explaining the situation. But I digress. I do not want to talk about encoding, decoding. Don't ask me about it. I don't want to talk about it, okay? The point was that this system.txt namespace has classes, or it contains classes, or it disambiguates any classes that deal with text, all right? So the third part is obviously the class name itself, string builder, and we already know what that does. So system.txt, it illustrates that namespaces can and often do contain other namespaces. The system namespace contains the text namespace, and the text namespace could contain other namespaces. I think it does, as a matter of fact. And you could use any number of namespaces if you wanted to. There's really, I don't think there's any limit to the number of namespaces you could use in order to help organize your code and avoid naming collisions to disambiguate the names of your classes. However, the developers of the .NET Framework class library realize that when you have too many nested namespaces in the definition for a class, it will add complexity. It makes it more difficult to use your library of code. So if you're ever in a position to create your own class libraries, specific to the company that you work for, you should use a very shallow set of namespaces, as shallow as possible. So just maybe one namespace or possibly two namespaces in order to serve the purpose of disambiguating the code from the code that's written for the finance department versus the marketing department versus the advertising market department rather within your organization. All right, don't want to talk about that either. Let's continue on. So as you take a look at this line of code, line number 14, you might think to yourself, okay, but I know we don't have to type this in every time we want to use a class name. Is there a shortcut for this? And obviously there is. So I suppose one way that you can find the class that you're looking for is just kind of traverse the IntelliSense and find the given namespaces that you want to use and just keep working your way through them until you find the class that you need to work with. But typically what happens is you know the class you need, you just don't remember which namespace it's in. So you kind of got to take the opposite approach. And so that's what using directives are for. They shorten the amount of code that you have to write in order to get at a given class name. All right, so a using directive provides access to all the namespaces and classes that belong to that using directive, so that you don't have to type out that portion of the class name or the namespace every time you want to use it. So you're telling the compiler, I'm using these namespaces, so before you complain, please check these namespaces first to ensure that the class I'm referencing in my code belongs to one of them first. So you'll notice at the top of every file, every C# file, even the ones that you add by going, right-click, add, class. For example, the new class file template will include using directives as well. They're added by default whenever you add anything, a new web form, a new class, and they're added as a convenience so that you don't have to add them yourself. And you can remove the using statements that you don't think you're going to need. So for example, I could remove the system.collections.generic and the system.link using directives if I'm not going to work with collections and I'm not going to use link in my application. Okay, and so typically what developers do, they like to keep this list tidy so they can be expressive and they know exactly what's going on in their code. Removing unused using statements, or directives rather, helps developers comprehend the code better. And you can decide if that's something that you prefer to do once you get more experience. It's certainly not necessary. At compilation time, the C# compiler will ignore any using statements that were not needed. Okay, so what I want to do is now take another approach at building the string builder, and we'll just do string builder SB equals new string builder. And you'll recall that at the time I showed you a couple of ways to get around the issue that that Visual Studio doesn't recognize the name string builder. And I said, you can see that there's this little blue dash under the capital S in string builder, and you can hover your mouse cursor over it and it opens up a little helper window here. And one of the options in the helper window is to include the using directive for system.txt. And we certainly could click that, and when we do, it adds that to the list of using statements at the very top of our code. But let me go ahead and delete that and show you another way to go about this. Whenever you see that underscore, that little blue outline dash, you can hit the control period on your keyboard, control period, and then use the arrow keys to select one of the options. One of the options is to go ahead and use the full class name, but I'm going to add the using directive for system.txt, and you can see it's added back up there, and everything's happy. So I think that the control period is a better approach because your hands don't have to leave the keyboard. Again, I know I need string builder, but I may not remember which namespace it belongs to, so I can simply type it. I see the blue dash, control period. It's probably already selected the line in the helper menu, and I can just hit the enter key on my keyboard, and then I can continue on writing code from that point on. Now, occasionally you're going to attempt to use a class in the framework class library, but you'll get an error that says something about there being ambiguity. The reason is because you have two using statements that both happen to have a class with that name in it. All right, so in that case, you'll merely have to type out some or all of the full namespace in order to get your code working again. So that's basically the equivalent of using the name Robert here as a class name, as my name, and having a using statement for Tabor.Theron, but then also Smith.Emmanuel, okay? And there's two Roberts. There's a Robert in both of those namespaces. And if that were to happen, then the C# compiler says, wait a second, I don't know which Robert you meant. But you have two using statements or using directives with the exact same class name in it. So in that case, you're going to have to probably just use the full namespace in order to let the compiler know which one you actually meant. So one last tip: whenever you're looking for help online in MSDN and you're searching for information on a given class name or a method name, sometimes in the search you might want to add the entire namespace. Otherwise, you might be looking at the help for a class by the same name but a different namespace, and it leads you off in a whole other direction, or you might be confused that, wait, this doesn't do what I thought it was doing. You're probably not in the correct area of the MSDN help that documents every single class and method, and so you need to include the full namespace in order to find the help for the given class and class method that you're looking for. Okay? All right, so before we close this discussion of namespaces, I want to point out three things. First of all, every class that you write, whether it's part of the web forms code behind file or a custom class file like we added in one of the previous lessons, or even a Windows form, the class will be contained in a namespace. Now, we've glossed over the namespace declaration in each file, as I pointed out earlier in this lesson, but it's always been there at the top level of the code that we've been writing. The default namespace will always be the name of your project, or it'll be modified to fit the naming rules of classes in .NET. So in this case, even though the project name is CS-ASP_040, you can see that it got rid of the dash and used underscore instead. And the way that you can change this is to actually select the project in the Solution Explorer and right-click it and select Properties. And here you can see on the very first tab on the left-hand side, the Application tab, there's a default namespace, and that again is created by default. I could change the default namespace, and from now on, whenever I add any new classes, it'll use the new default namespace instead of this original one, and I just have to go back and change all references to that namespace, the old namespace, in my application. But let me say this, for simple applications, you probably never need to modify or add additional namespaces. Again, this is really only going to come into play whenever you're using something in the .NET Framework class library, or whenever you're building your own class libraries, which I don't anticipate you doing, not for a while at least. Okay. And then the third thing that I want to point out, and I guess mentioned it accidentally here, is that you can create new namespaces for your own code. Again, the technique is very simple, but the reason why you might want to choose to do this is a rather advanced topic. Again, if you set out to build a large software application, organizing your code in namespaces will become more important to you. So I discussed designing namespaces and partitioning code out in the architecture series, which is along I believe, the green track. Okay, I can't see it right here, for maintenance-driven architecture. But real short, if I wanted to create, like for example, a new class, and I want this class to deal with some department, I'll just go ahead and click add here. I can just create a new namespace by going to this namespace and just adding something after it, like .marketing. All right, and so class 1 would be inside of the CS-ASP040.marketing namespace. All right, and if I were to try to use the new class 1 inside of the default.aspx.cs, so I try to use class 1, and it can't find it. Why can't it find it? Because it's not in the same namespace as the code that I'm currently working in. All right, but if I were to change that, well, let me show you this. Okay, we can add a using statement like now, and it'll be fine with it. All right, but let's not do that. Let's delete that, and let's remove that. The other option for class 1 is then to change the class's definition, changing its namespace, removing the .marketing, and now it should be able to see class 1, and I can move on from here. C1 equals new class 1, and it should be happy once IntelliSense gets a chance to think about it, and it is. Okay, great. Okay, so we talked about quite a few topics related to namespaces and the using directive and their significance, to disambiguate class names, whether in the .NET Framework class library or within your own class libraries. And hopefully now you understand the significance of the class library and why you have to have either a using directive or use the full name of the class. It's for the benefit of the C# compiler. Okay, so we're going to continue on in the next lesson and do something really fun. We'll see you there. Thanks.